To the world, he was the most popular young man alive, the Golden Prince, who could stand in a crowd of thousands and leave each of them certain he had smiled at them alone. Photographers chased him. Whole nations lined the streets. He was the future of the English throne, and he wore it as lightly as a coat. But the men who served him wrote something colder in their diaries. One private secretary, who gave 9 years at his side, came to believe that the best thing that could happen to the country would be for the prince to break his neck. He would give up a throne for the woman he loved and spend the next 35 years proving that nothing on earth could satisfy him. This is the story of the king nobody could stand. If you enjoy the stories the polished histories leave out, the ones told from inside the household rather than from the throne, then subscribe and stay with this one to the end, because the coldest verdict comes last. Chapter 1. The world's most charming prince. He was born into the very center of an empire that ruled a quarter of the earth, and from his first breath, everything was arranged around the single fact that one day he would be king. It was the 23rd of June, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, and the child was given a string of names heavy with the weight of 2 dynasties: Edward Albert Christian, George Andrew Patrick David. To the public, he would one day be Edward. To his family, he was only ever David, the last name on the list, the private one, and the one that would follow him into exile long after the others had fallen away. His great-grandmother was Queen Victoria, and she was still on the throne for the first 6 years of his life, a small black-clad figure at the head of the largest empire the world had ever seen. His grandfather would become Edward VII. His father would become George V. He was, in the plain arithmetic of monarchy, the heir to the heir to the heir, and there was never a moment, from the cradle onward, when the shape of his life was in any doubt. Other children were born into families. He was born into a line of succession, and the difference would mark everything he became. The world he entered was one of almost unimaginable order and confidence. Britain sat at the head of an empire on which, in the phrase of the age, the sun never set. An empire that governed something close to a quarter of all the people alive. Its navy ruled the oceans. Its bankers financed half the trade of the planet. And at the top of the whole vast machine sat a family that had learned, over the long reign of Victoria, to present itself as the still and dutiful centre of it all. The monarch did not rule in the old sense, but the monarch embodied something, a standard of conduct, a promise that the man at the summit would give his whole life to a role rather than use the role to feed himself. That promise was the family business, and David was the son who would one day have to keep it. From the beginning, he was a slight, fair, delicate-looking boy, blonde and boyish, with a face that photographed beautifully and would go on photographing beautifully for the rest of his life. The camera loved him in an age when the camera was becoming the most powerful force in public life, and this accident of appearance would do more to build his early legend than any deed he ever performed. He looked like what people wanted a prince to look like. He looked younger than his years, boyish into middle age, and there was, in that permanent youthfulness, something the public found irresistible, and something the people close to him found faintly alarming, as though the man had never quite finished becoming one. His upbringing was rigid, cold, and dutiful in the way of the royal households of the time. His father, George V, was a bluff, short-tempered man who loved his children through discipline and correction, and a horror of anything soft or showy. His mother, Queen Mary, was magnificent, remote, and dutiful to the bone. A woman who had trained herself so thoroughly to serve the crown that warmth came to her only with difficulty. The nursery was strict, the tutors were exacting, and the boy who emerged from it had learned all the outward forms of royal life while absorbing, somewhere underneath, a lasting resistance to the discipline those forms demanded. He was sent to naval college, as his father wished, and he endured it rather than shone at it. He went up to Oxford and left without a degree, which troubled no one, because a prince did not need one. And in 1911, at the age of 17, he was invested as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle in a great pageant of feathers and robes, presented to the crowds of Wales as their prince, in a ceremony half medieval and half invented for the cameras. He stood there and played the part, because playing the part in public was the one thing he could always do, and do better than anyone the family had produced in generations. That was the paradox, planted at the very start. The surface was perfect, and the interior was already in quiet revolt. He could wear the robes and work the crowd and charm a room to its knees. And at the same moment, he could resent every hour the role demanded of him when the cameras were switched off. The people who only saw the surface adored him without reservation. The people who saw both began, very early, to worry. It is worth pausing on the nature of the inheritance he was resenting, because to understand the man, it helps to understand the size of the thing he had been born to carry. The crown he would one day wear was not a decoration. It was the still point of a global order, the symbol around which a quarter of humanity was governed, and the whole authority of it rested on a single unspoken bargain. The monarch was granted wealth and reverence, and a place above all other men, and in exchange the monarch gave up the ordinary freedom to please himself, submitting his whole life to the service of the role. Kings before him had chafed at that bargain in private, but they had kept it, because they understood that the moment the man began to serve himself rather than the crown, the magic that held the whole thing together began to fail. David had been raised on this understanding from the nursery, drilled in it by a father who embodied it, and from very early he gave every sign of a boy who wanted the reverence without the surrender. His education was designed to break that tendency and never quite managed it. He was sent as a boy to naval college in the tradition of his family, where the discipline was harsh and the days were regimented, and he endured the experience rather than thrived in it, marked out, homesick and unhappy, among boys who did not defer to him as the wider world had learned to. Afterward, he went up to Oxford, to the ancient colleges where the sons of the ruling class were polished, and he left again after a short time without troubling to take a degree which mattered to no one, because a future king was thought to need charm and bearing rather than learning. What the Naval College and the university had in common was that both tried, in their different ways, to teach him submission to a system larger than himself, and both failed. He came out of his education exactly as he had gone into it, gifted, restless, and unwilling to be mastered by anything. The First World War gave the young prince his first taste of real popularity, and it was genuine. He wanted to fight, was forbidden from the front line for fear of capture, and chafed against the safety imposed on him, which the public read, correctly, as courage of a sort. He visited the trenches. He was seen among ordinary soldiers, and when the war ended, he emerged as the bright young hope of a country exhausted by slaughter, a prince who seemed to belong to the new century rather than the old one, who danced and smiled and looked forward rather than back. There was a hunger in the country, in those first raw years after the war, for exactly what he seemed to offer. A generation had been fed into the machinery of the trenches and destroyed, and the old certainties had died with them. And here was a young prince who looked like the future rather than the past, who smiled where his father frowned, who seemed to promise that the world might yet be bright again. He caught the mood of the moment perfectly, and the mood carried him. The adoration that met him everywhere was not only for the man, but for the hope he was made to embody. the sense that the long nightmare was over and something younger and gentler was coming. He gave the exhausted country a face to love, and it loved him without stint. And for a decade, the arrangement suited everyone: the prince who wanted to be adored, and the people who wanted someone to adore. The stage was set for the most dazzling royal career of the age, and for a time, through the whole of the 1920s, that is exactly what it looked like it would be. Chapter 2. A smile the whole world followed. By the 1920s, he had become something the monarchy had never produced before: a celebrity, adored across the empire and beyond by millions of people who would never once meet him. The word for it did not quite exist yet in the way it does now, but the thing itself had arrived, and he was its first royal example. He was famous in the modern sense, famous for the way he looked and moved and smiled, famous in a way that had less to do with what he did than with the feeling people had when they saw him. And in that new kind of fame he was, for a decade, without a rival anywhere on earth. The engine of it was the imperial tour. His father sent him out across the empire as a kind of living advertisement for the crown, and the young prince proved astonishingly good at the work. He went to Canada, and the crowds were enormous. He went to the United States, where a country that had thrown off kings a century and a half before lost its head entirely over this slight, smiling English prince. He went to Australia and New Zealand, to India, to Africa, to South America, and everywhere the pattern repeated. The streets filled, the newspapers swooned, women wept and reached for him, and he stood in the middle of it, apparently effortless, radiating the warmth that the cameras drank up and sent around the world. There was a real gift in it, and it should not be dismissed. He had an instinct for the human moment that his stiff, dutiful father entirely lacked. He would break from the planned route to shake a hand that had not been arranged. He would speak to a wounded veteran, a minor, a child, and make that person feel, for a few seconds, like the only human being in the world. It was the exact skill that the modern age was beginning to prize above all others: the common touch, the ability to seem ordinary and approachable while remaining utterly set apart. And he had it to a degree that no one around him could quite explain or teach. To grasp the scale of the adoration is to grasp how strange his later obscurity would be. He drew crowds that would not disgrace a coronation in cities that had no king, in countries that had fought to be rid of kings, in lands his ancestors had never seen. In Canada, the receptions were vast enough to stop cities. In the United States, a republic that had thrown off the rule of his family's crown a century and a half before, the newspapers and the public lost themselves entirely in the spectacle of the young English prince, and the pattern held wherever he went, through Australia and New Zealand, through India, through the far reaches of Africa and South America. He was the first member of his family to be a truly global figure in the modern sense, known and loved by name and by face across the whole span of the empire and beyond it. And the affection was of a kind no royal person had ever commanded before: personal, passionate, and enormous. The men who arranged these tours understood exactly what they had in him, and they used it, because a monarchy that could produce this kind of feeling in its people was a monarchy that could not easily be shaken. He was, in the cold language of the palace, an asset of the first importance, the living proof that the ancient institution could still command the love of the modern world. And he played the part, for the most part, magnificently, giving the crowds the warmth they had come for, sending them home certain they had glimpsed something golden. It was only afterward, in the private hours, that the other man appeared, the one who found the whole business exhausting and tedious and beneath him, and who let his household know it in a steady stream of complaint. His clothes became the fashion of the age. When he wore a particular soft collar, men across 2 continents bought the same collar. When he knotted a tie in a fuller way, the knot was named after him and copied in a million mirrors. When he put on a certain check, or a soft hat, or a particular cut of trouser, the tailors of London and New York rushed to follow. He was, in a phrase that would have baffled his grandmother, a trendsetter, the most watched and most imitated man of his generation, and he understood the power of it and enjoyed it. Appearance was the thing he had mastered completely. It would remain the thing he cared about, in one form or another, until the day he died. To the public, he was the future, and the future looked bright and modern and kind. Here, they thought, was a king in waiting who understood the new century, who could talk to a factory worker as easily as to a duke, who brought a breath of informality and warmth into an institution that had grown grey and remote under his father. The affection was vast, and it was sincere. For a great many ordinary people in Britain and across the Empire, the Prince of Wales was quite simply the most beloved public figure alive, and the thought that he would one day be their king was a source of real happiness. But those closest to the machine could see what the crowds could not. The charm was real, and so was something else underneath it, a growing distaste for the parts of the job that did not come with applause. The tours produced magnificent photographs and glowing reports, and they also produced a stream of private complaints from the prince about the tedium of it all, the heat, the boredom, the endless official dinners, the sheer grind of duty between the golden public moments. He loved the crowd. He disliked the work that earned the crowd, and the men whose task it was to keep him to his engagements began to notice how often he wanted to cut them short, to leave early, to hand the dull half of the role to someone else while he kept the bright half for himself. There was drink, and there was gambling, and there was a restless, jittery energy that never seemed to settle into anything. He kept late hours and rose unwillingly. He grew bored at the centre of his own triumphs. And there was, above all, the pattern that would define his private life for 20 years. The pursuit of married women, older than himself, who could mother and manage and adore him in equal measure. The public saw a golden bachelor prince. The household saw a man who moved from one married mistress to the next, drawn again and again to women already bound to other men, as though the point were the devotion rather than the freedom to marry. There was a shape to these attachments that the people around him came to know well. He did not want a bride to stand beside him as an equal partner in the work of the crown. He wanted a woman older and stronger than himself, who would take him in hand, order his moods, and pour upon him the fierce, managing devotion of a mother rather than the companionship of a wife. Frida Dudley Ward held that place in his life for years, and then Thelma Furness after her. Both of them married, both of them cast in the same role, both of them, in the end, discarded when a stronger woman came. The prince who could command the love of millions seemed unable to stand on his own without one particular woman to lean upon entirely, and the household watched him pass from one to the next with a growing unease about what it revealed. A man so dependent, so hungry to be managed, so incapable of standing alone, was a strange sort of man to place at the head of an empire. And yet none of it dented the public worship in the slightest, because none of it was allowed to reach the public at all. The pattern of mistresses, the drink, the late nights, the neglect of duty, all of it stayed sealed behind the walls of deference that still protected the royal family in that age, invisible to the millions who adored the smiling image. The gap between the two men, the golden prince the world loved and the hollow, hungry man his servants knew, grew wider year by year. and only a handful of people stood in the space between them and saw both at once. Those few were the ones who would leave the truest record, and what they recorded was not admiration. None of it reached the newspapers. The press of the age did not report such things about the royal family, and the machinery of deference was still strong enough to keep the private man entirely hidden behind the public one. So the legend grew, unbroken and gleaming, through the whole of the decade. The most popular young man in the world, the smiling prince, the modern hope of an ancient throne. And underneath it, invisible to the millions, the men who served him were beginning to write a very different account in their private papers, an account that would take decades to surface, and that began with a single chilling conclusion. The charm went all the way to the surface, and no deeper. Chapter 3. The Father Who Saw It First. His own father looked at the adored heir and saw ruin coming, and gave voice to it by the account that has come down, in a sentence that would come to sound like prophecy. George V was not a subtle man, and he was not an affectionate one, but he had spent his whole life inside the machinery of monarchy, and he understood exactly what the job required, because he had given his own life to it without complaint. He looked at his glamorous eldest son, the darling of the crowds, and what he saw was a danger. After I am dead, he is reported to have said, "The boy will ruin himself in 12 months." It was the judgment of a father who loved his son and did not much like him, and it would prove almost exactly right. The distance between father and son had been there from the start, and the 1920s widened it into a gulf. George V was rigid, punctual, dutiful, and easily shocked, a man of fixed habits who expected the world to hold as still as he did. His son was everything he distrusted: modern, restless, fashionable, drawn to nightclubs and married women and the fast American set, forever pushing against the forms his father held sacred. The old king thundered about his son's clothes, his friends, his refusal to marry a suitable princess and produce an heir. The son listened, resented, and changed nothing. Between them there was no warmth to soften the disapproval, and so the disapproval simply hardened, year by year, into something close to despair. Queen Mary felt it too, though she expressed it differently. Where her husband raged, she withdrew into a magnificent, sorrowful silence. She had given herself so completely to the idea of the crown that she could not comprehend a son who treated it as a burden rather than a trust. She loved him, in her contained and dutiful way, and she watched his choices with a dismay that never left her for the rest of her long life. The mother and the son would end, decades later, estranged and unreconciled, and the seeds of that estrangement were already in the ground during these years, in her inability to reach him and his refusal to be reached. What neither parent could fathom was the quality that most alarmed the household: the sense that the disapproval simply did not land. A son who felt his father's anger and his mother's sorrow might have been wounded by them, might have bent, might have tried to earn back the regard he was losing. This son seemed untouched. The thunder of the king rolled over him and left him unchanged. The silent grief of the queen reached him and found nothing to hold on to. He heard the disapproval, and he carried on exactly as before, not out of open rebellion, but out of a kind of imperviousness, as though the judgment of the two people who had made him weighed no more than the judgment of a stranger. To his parents, it was baffling and painful. To the men who watched from the household, it was the same emptiness they saw in everything about him: the charm that reached everyone, and the feeling that reached no one, the strange, smooth surface off which even a father's despair slid away without a trace. What worried the family most was not the drink or the women in themselves, but what they revealed about the man underneath. a prince was allowed his pleasures, within reason. What a prince was not allowed was to shirk the work, and the work was beginning, quietly, to go undone. The red boxes of state papers that came to him were left unread, or half-read, or pushed aside for the racecourse and the dinner table. Documents entrusted to the prince came back late, or barely looked at, or did not come back at all. His engagements were kept, but grudgingly, and cut short whenever he could manage it. The pattern was small at first, and easy to excuse in a young man, but it did not go away as he aged. It deepened. The people whose task it was to run his official life saw all of this from the inside, and they were the first to grasp what it meant. A monarchy runs on the quiet, unglamorous labor of the man at the top, the reading, the signing, the sitting through the tedious hours, the daily submission of self to role. The crowds never see it, and it is the whole of the job. And here was an heir who could do the shining public half brilliantly and would not do the grinding private half at all. To the household, it was a matter of fitness. A king who would not read his boxes was not a king who could reign. The state papers were the heart of the trouble, because they were the point where the private failing became a matter of real consequence. Every day, the government sent to the prince, as it sent to his father, the working documents of the realm, the reports and the dispatches and the daily business of an empire, entrusted to him on the understanding that he would read them and absorb them. His father had handled them with the exactness of a man who understood their weight. The prince handled them with a carelessness that dismayed the men around him, reading them late or not at all, pushing them aside for his pleasures, treating the business of the nation as an interruption to be got through, or simply ignored. It was a small thing, in a way, a matter of paperwork. And it was, in another way, the whole thing, the visible sign of a man who would not subordinate himself to the role, and who therefore could not safely be trusted with it. The family agonized over what could be done, and the answer was nothing. There was no mechanism to remove an heir, no way to set aside the man the accident of birth had placed next in line. They could only watch and hope that maturity would work the change that discipline had failed to work, and marry him off, if they could, to a suitable princess who might steady him. But the years passed, and the change did not come, and the suitable marriage never happened, and the prince moved through his 30s exactly as he had moved through his 20s, restless, self-absorbed, and bound to one married woman after another. The dread in the household deepened into something like certainty. The reign, when it came, would be a disaster. They did not know its shape yet, could not have guessed the woman or the abdication. They knew only that the man was wrong for the throne, and that nothing could be done but wait for the throne to reach him. There was, beneath it, something colder still, a quality the men around him found harder to name. It was a kind of emptiness at the centre, a sense that behind the dazzling warmth there was no corresponding depth of feeling, that the prince, who could make a stranger feel like the only person in the world, did not himself feel very much about anyone. He was charming to everyone, and attached to almost no one, beyond the current woman who occupied his whole attention. The warmth was real in the moment, and it evaporated the moment passed. Those who worked closely with him began to suspect that the famous charm was not the outer layer of a rich inner life, but very nearly the whole of the man, a brilliant surface with a strange hollowness behind it. His mother once put her finger on part of it. She could not understand, she said, a son who would put his own wishes above the duty he had been born to carry. His father put it more bluntly, in that grim prophecy about ruin within a year, and a young man in the prince's own office, a private secretary of unusual sharpness and unusual honesty, was beginning to arrive at the darkest conclusion of all. one he would eventually set down in words that have never lost their power to shock. He had watched the prince for years now, at close range, in private and in public, and he had decided that the most admired young man in the world was at his core, a man who had been given every gift the world could offer and denied the one that mattered. That verdict, and the man who reached it, is where the story turns from legend toward truth. Chapter 4. The Prince Who Became King. On the 20th of January 1936, the old king died, and the Golden Prince finally reached the summit that had waited for him all his life. George V had been fading through the winter, worn out by his reign and his cares, and in the January of that year he died. His last worries, by the accounts that survive, were for the future of the empire in his son's hands. And then he was gone, and the man who had been Prince of Wales for a quarter of a century, the most watched heir in the world, became King Edward VIII, sovereign of Great Britain and the dominions beyond the seas, and head of an empire that still spanned the globe. For a moment, the whole edifice of the legend seemed about to be fulfilled. Here at last was the modern king the century had been promised, the charmer, the reformer, the man who could carry the ancient institution into a new age. The crowds that had adored him as prince now looked to him as king with a mixture of affection and hope. The newspapers, still bound by the old deference, printed nothing but praise. To the ordinary reader in Britain and across the empire, the accession of Edward VIII was the arrival of the bright future they had been watching approach for 20 years. But inside the palace, the mood was not hope. It was dread. The men who had served the old king, and who now served the new one, knew what the public did not. They knew about the unread boxes and the shortened engagements and the restless distaste for the work. They knew about the pattern of married women, and they knew, above all, about the one woman who now stood at the center of the new king's life, an American, married, and utterly in command of him. The very men whose duty was to make the reign succeed began it convinced in private that it could not. The death of the old king had come after a long decline, and there is a detail from his final illness that has never quite been settled, but that captures the family's foreboding perfectly. George V had spent his last strength worrying about what would happen to the throne and the empire once his eldest son sat upon it. He had said, in one form or another, more than once, that he prayed his son would never marry and have children, so that the crown might pass instead to his second son and then to the granddaughter he adored, a small girl named Elizabeth. It was an extraordinary thing for a king to wish, that his own heir might be passed over, and it measured the depth of his fear. He had looked at the most popular young man in the world and hoped the line would go around him. And within the year of his death, his fear would be realized in a way even he had not imagined, not by the heir failing to marry, but by the heir insisting on marrying the one woman he could not have. For a few weeks, though, none of this showed. The new king was proclaimed with all the ancient ceremony, and the country settled into the reign with a sense of a corner turned, a fresh and modern chapter begun. He was 41 years old, at the very height of his fame and his powers, holder of the ancient crown of England and head of the largest empire on earth. Everything his whole life had pointed toward had arrived. The boy raised for this single destiny had reached it at last, and the crowds that had watched him grow from a golden prince into a golden king felt that the promise of a generation was finally being kept. It was, on the surface, the summit of a charmed life. And yet the reign began, from its very first hours, with the small telling signs that the men around him had learned to read. He wished the ceremonial pared back, the costs cut, the old formalities loosened. And while some of this was sensible, the tone of it unsettled them, the sense of a king impatient with the very rituals that gave the crown its meaning. He broke small precedents carelessly, and let it be seen that the woman at the center of his life would not be kept quietly in the background where a king's mistress was expected to remain. To the public, these were trifles, or even charming modern touches. To the household, they were the first tremors of something they had long feared, a king who meant to have the position on his own terms, to keep what pleased him and discard what did not, exactly as he had done with every duty of his life before. The summit had been reached. The question was only how long a man of his character could be expected to hold it, and the men who knew him best were already counting not in years, but in months. The new king moved at once to remake the monarchy in his own image, and to the household his idea of reform looked a great deal like a determination to do less. He wanted the ceremony trimmed, the expense cut, the old formalities relaxed. Some of this was sensible and overdue, but much of it read, to the men watching closely, as a king who wished to enjoy the position while shedding its obligations, to keep the crown and lay down its weight. He was casual where his father had been exact. He kept ministers waiting. He handled the state papers, when he handled them at all, with the same carelessness he had shown as prince, reading them late or not at all, and treating the daily business of the realm as an intrusion on his time. To the men who had watched him as prince, none of this was a surprise. It was simply the same man, the same habits, the same distaste for the grinding half of the work, carried now to the very summit where the stakes were highest. The unread boxes of the heir had become the unread boxes of the sovereign, and the neglect that had been a worry in a prince became a graver thing in a king. The failing that had troubled the household for 20 years was no longer a private concern about a young man's character. It was now the working habit of the man at the head of the whole realm, and there was no longer anyone above him who could correct it. He was the king. The correction that his father had failed to impose could now come only from himself, and self-correction was the one discipline he had never learned. And over the whole of it, from the very first day, hung the question that would decide everything. He had come to the throne already bound to a woman the Constitution could not accept, and he had come to it, those close to him believed, with the private intention of marrying her whatever the cost. The men who served him spent the opening weeks of the reign in a state of quiet dread, watching for the moment the king would force the issue, knowing it must come, unsure only of when. They had spent 2 decades learning that this was a man who got what he wanted. Now he wanted the impossible, and he held, for the moment, the whole power of the crown with which to reach for it. And through all of it ran the question that no one could yet speak aloud in public, the question of the woman. He had reached the throne, but he had reached it already bound, heart and will, to a person the Constitution and the Church could not possibly accept as his queen. The men around him could see the collision coming from the first day of the reign, could see that the new king intended, sooner or later, to force the issue, and that he would choose, if it came to a choice, the woman over the crown. They had spent 20 years watching him want things and get them. Now he wanted the one thing the whole system was built to deny him, and he had, for the moment, all the power of the throne with which to pursue it. So the reign of Edward VIII began at the very peak of his life and under the shadow of its ending, both at once. To the world outside, it was the dawn everyone had waited for. The charming prince become king at last, the modern reign begun. Within the walls, it was the opening of a crisis that would test the monarchy more severely than anything in living memory, and that would be decided, in the end, not by armies or parliaments, but by the character of one man. Everything he had been given had brought him here, to the highest place in the empire, adored by millions, holding the ancient crown of England. The question that the next 11 months would answer was whether there was anything inside him equal to it. The men who knew him best had already guessed the answer, and the first of them had walked out of his service years before, unable to watch any longer. Chapter 5. The Secretary Who Could Not Stay. For 9 years, one man ran the prince's office, watched him closely at the nearest possible range, and then walked away in disgust on the first day of a new year. His name was Alan Lascelles, though everyone called him Tommy, and he was as sharp and honest an observer as the royal household of that age produced. He had joined the prince's service in 1920 as an assistant private secretary, a clever, dutiful man who came to the work believing in the young prince and in the future he seemed to promise. He left it 9 years later believing in neither, and the story of how his faith drained away is the story of the real man behind the legend, told by the person best placed to tell it. Lascelles had come to the job at the height of the prince's glory, when the tours were triumphs and the crowds were vast, and the whole world seemed to be in love with his employer. From the inside, week by week, he watched the shine come off. He watched the drinking. He watched the gambling. He watched the pursuit of one married woman after another. And more than any of these, which a tolerant man might have forgiven in a young prince, he watched the steady, corrosive neglect of the actual work. The boxes ignored, the duties dodged, the deep and apparently bottomless selfishness of a man who arranged the entire world around his own pleasure and comfort and gave almost nothing back. Year after year, Lascelles waited for the prince to grow into the role, as young men often do, to steady, to deepen, to take up the weight. It never happened. If anything, the pattern hardened as the prince moved through his 30s, the same restlessness, the same distaste for duty, the same childlike need to be indulged and amused, set now, not in a boy, but in a grown man who would one day be king. And slowly, reluctantly, the loyal secretary came to a conclusion that horrified him even as he reached it. The man he served was not merely flawed. He was, in some essential way, unfit, and no amount of waiting would change it. The breaking point came, and on the first day of January 1929, Lascelles resigned. It was a grave step for a man of his kind, to walk away from the service of the heir to the throne, and he did not do it quietly or evasively. When the prince asked him why he wished to leave, Lascelles did not offer the usual soft excuses of ill health or family duty. He told him the truth. As he set it down afterwards, he paced the prince's room for the best part of an hour, telling him, as he might have told a younger brother, exactly what he thought of him and his whole scheme of life. An hour, in a private room, the servant telling the future king to his face that the way he was living his life was a disgrace. Few men in that position have ever dared as much, and fewer still have been proved so completely right. Think for a moment what it took to do such a thing. Lascelles was a courtier, a man whose entire career and standing depended on the favour of the royal house, and the man across the room from him was the heir to the throne, the future fount of all honour in the land. To speak to such a man as one might speak to an erring younger brother, to spend an hour laying out to his face every fault of his character and every failure of his life, was to risk everything, and Lascelles did it anyway, because he had reached the point where he could no longer serve in silence. He was not a hot-tempered man given to outbursts. He was cool, precise, and immensely self-controlled, one of the ablest officials of his generation, and the fact that a man of his temperament was driven to such an extremity tells its own story about what he had been watching. It was not a quarrel. It was a considered verdict, delivered at great personal cost, by a man who had run out of any other way to register the truth, and the years would vindicate every word of it. This same Lascelles having walked away from the prince in disgust, went on to become one of the most trusted and respected courtiers in the whole history of the modern monarchy, assistant private secretary. In time to the prince's father, and then private secretary to his brother, the steady hand at the centre of the palace through the abdication and the war and after. His judgment was prized by kings and prime ministers alike. He was, by universal agreement, a man of exceptional shrewdness and exceptional discretion, not a gossip, not a grudge-bearer, but a supremely reliable reader of character. So when this man, of all men, concluded that the Golden Prince was fundamentally unfit, the conclusion carried a weight that no idle criticism ever could. He was the most credible witness the palace possessed, and his testimony against the prince was absolute. What is most striking about the scene is the prince's response, or rather the absence of one. He heard the hour of blunt truth, and it changed nothing. He did not argue the case, did not defend his scheme of life, did not resolve to reform. He simply let his secretary go and carried on exactly as before. The words that would have wounded a more feeling man seemed to slide off him without leaving a mark, and this, to Lascelles, was itself the most damning thing of all. A man who could hear such a verdict from a trusted servant and feel nothing was a man in whom something was missing, and the secretary was beginning to understand precisely what. For Lascelles did not hate the prince, and that is what gives his verdict its weight. He was not a bitter man nursing a grievance. He was a devoted royal servant who had wanted, with his whole heart, to believe in the future king, and who had been forced, against his own wishes, to stop. His judgment was the judgment of the disappointed rather than the malicious, and it was all the harder for it. He would go on, in later years, to serve the prince's father and then his brother with complete loyalty, one of the most trusted courtiers of his age. His problem was never with the crown. It was only with this one man who would wear it, and whom he had come to know too well to admire. It is this quality of reluctance that makes his testimony so hard to dismiss. There are always people willing to speak ill of the great, and their words are cheap, coloured by envy or grievance, or the wish to seem important. Lascelles was the opposite of all that. He had wanted to believe. He had given 9 years of his life and the best of his considerable abilities to the service of a man he had hoped would be a great king, and he had let go of that hope slowly, painfully, and only when the evidence left him no choice. His verdict was wrung out of him against his own inclination by a man who would have given a great deal to reach a different conclusion. When a hostile witness condemns a man, it proves little. When a devoted one does, having fought against the condemnation for years, it proves a great deal. And Lascelles was as devoted as they came, right up to the moment he could bear it no longer. He kept his darkest conclusions to his private papers and his closest confidences, as a discreet servant must. But he had formed them, and they were absolute. He had decided that the most charming man in the world was hollow at the centre, that the warmth was a surface and nothing lay behind it, that the prince was incapable of the deep feeling and the steady duty that the role demanded, and that ordinary decency demanded too. He had watched a golden idol at the closest range a man can watch another, and he had found, behind the gold, a strange and frightening emptiness. And there was one particular moment, on a hot African night the year before he resigned, that had shown him the emptiness plainly, a moment he never forgot and never quite forgave. Chapter 6. A telegram he did not believe. On an African tour, a telegram arrived saying the king might be dying, and the prince read it and felt nothing at all. It was 1928, and the Prince of Wales was on a long tour through East Africa, travelling and enjoying himself far from the duties of home. Lascelles was with him, and into the middle of the tour came word from London, urgent and grave, that George V had fallen seriously ill, that the old king might not live, that the heir should perhaps prepare to come home, and, if the worst happened, to take the throne. It was the single most important message a Prince of Wales can receive, and the prince's response to it was the thing that finished Lascelles forever. He would not believe it. He brushed the news aside, according to the account Lascelles left, treating the report of his father's possible death as an exaggeration, an inconvenience, a thing that need not disturb his plans. He did not want to cut the tour short. He did not want to hurry home to a dying father's side and the duty that waited there. He wanted to go on with his pleasures, and so he told himself and those around him that the alarm was overblown and there was no need to change anything. To a son who loved his father, such news would have been a blow. To this son, it was, above all, a nuisance. Lascelles was appalled, and he said so, in the plainest terms a servant could use to a prince. This was not a private matter of manners now. The heir was proposing to dawdle in Africa, while the king lay perhaps dying, and the throne perhaps stood empty. And the secretary told him, bluntly, that the news was serious and that he must go home. What he saw in the prince's reaction was not grief managed with dignity, which would have been admirable, but grief simply absent, a coldness where feeling should have been, an inability to care about even this, even his own father's death, when it collided with his own convenience. It was the emptiness he had long suspected, shown now at full size, and it settled his decision to leave. The moment deserves to be sat with, because it strips away every excuse. A young man may be forgiven a great deal: the drink, the women, the boredom, the vanity, all the ordinary failings of a spoiled and privileged life. These things pass, or they are outgrown, or they are the froth on a character that is sound underneath. What Lascelles saw on that African night was not froth. It was the bottom of the well, the thing the froth had always been floating on. A man who can hear that his father may be dying and feel, above all, the irritation of an interrupted holiday is a man in whom something fundamental is missing. Not a bad habit, but an absence. A hollow where the ordinary human feeling should sit. And it was this, precisely this, that Lascelles had glimpsed for years and now saw plainly, and that would define the man to the very end of his life. The old king, as it happened, recovered from that particular illness and lived several more years, so the crisis passed and the tour went on. But the thing it had revealed did not pass. Lascelles carried it with him, and when he came to sum up the prince he served, he reached past all the surface failings for the absence at the centre. The charm, the beauty, the position, the adoration, all of it was real, and all of it was surface. And behind the surface, where the deepest thing in a person should live, Lascelles had looked and found nothing there. The words he chose to name that emptiness would follow the man for the rest of the century. It was in the aftermath of this, reflecting on the man he served, that Lascelles reached for the words that have followed the Duke of Windsor ever since. The coldest and most exact verdict any courtier has ever passed on a member of the royal family. The prince, he said, was like a child in the fairy stories who had been given every gift except a soul. Beauty, charm, position, wealth, the love of millions, all of it heaped upon one man, and behind it, where the deepest thing should have been, nothing. It is a devastating sentence, and its power comes from the fact that the man who spoke it had spent 9 years earning the right to speak it at the closest range, against his own deepest wish to believe otherwise. Lascelles went further still. This prince, he judged, never cared about England or the English, For all the crowds who cared so passionately about him, the affection ran one way only. The millions poured out their love, and he took it, enjoyed it, fed on it, and returned, in the secretary's cold estimate, nothing of substance to the country whose future he was born to carry. It was a terrible thing to conclude about the most popular man in the world, and Lascelles concluded it not in anger, but in sorrow, and held to it for the rest of his long life. There was another moment, earlier still, that Lascelles carried with him and later recorded, a conversation with the Prime Minister of the day, Stanley Baldwin, during an earlier tour. The two men, the courtier and the statesman, had fallen to talking honestly about the prince and his future, and Lascelles had said something he never forgot having said. He could not help thinking, he told Baldwin, that the best thing that could happen to the prince and to the country would be for him to break his neck. It was an astonishing thing for a loyal servant to say aloud that the heir's death in a riding accident would be a mercy for the nation he was meant to lead. And Baldwin's reply was more astonishing still. "God forgive me," the Prime Minister said. "I have often thought the same." These were not reckless men, and that is the point that gives the exchange its chill. Stanley Baldwin would steer the country through the abdication itself with a sure and careful hand. Lascelles would become the most trusted courtier of his age. Neither was given to wild talk or to malice, and neither wished the prince any personal harm. What they were expressing, in that grim shorthand, was a settled and reluctant judgment, arrived at by two of the most responsible men in the kingdom, that the heir to the throne was so unfit for the role that his early death would be a mercy for the nation. They had each looked at the Golden Prince and seen, behind the adoration of the crowds, the same ruin that his own father had foreseen, and they had each, in their private hearts, concluded that the country would be safer if he never reigned at all. That is the astonishing gap this story turns on, the distance between the public prince and the private verdict. Outside the palace walls, he was the most beloved man alive, the future of the monarchy, the hope of a generation. Inside them, the men who knew him best, his own secretary and his own prime minister, quietly agreed that his death would be a blessing. The crowds could see only the surface, and the surface was golden. The men behind the closed doors could see the whole of him, and what they saw filled them with dread. For the next few years the surface held, and the world went on adoring the prince who would be king. And then, in the abdication, the surface finally cracked, and the country was given its first real glimpse of the man the courtiers had always known. Sit with that exchange for a moment, because it is the true measure of how the men at the very top of the state regarded the Golden Prince behind the closed doors. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the private secretary to the heir, two of the most responsible men in the country, agreed in a quiet moment that the nation would be better off if its future king simply died before he could reign. They loved the crown. They dreaded the man who would wear it. And they were not cruel or foolish men reaching a wild conclusion. They were careful, dutiful men who knew him and who had looked into the future and seen, quite clearly, the ruin that his father had also foreseen. Within a few short years, in the abdication crisis, the whole world would learn what these men had known all along. The prince who had been given every gift would give away the greatest one of all, and prove them right. Chapter 7. The Woman He Would Not Give Up. By the middle of the 1930s, one woman had displaced every rival and taken a hold on him that nothing, not even a crown, could break. Her name was Wallis Simpson, an American from Baltimore, sharp, witty, elegantly dressed, and already twice married by the time she took her place at the center of the prince's life. She had a first marriage behind her, ended in divorce and a second husband still in place, a quiet businessman named Ernest Simpson, when the Prince of Wales fell under her spell and stayed there for the rest of his days. To the family and the household, she was the culmination of everything they had feared in his long parade of married mistresses, the pattern carried to its most dangerous conclusion. She had entered his circle in the early 1930s, one more clever married woman among the fast set the prince favoured, and at first she seemed no different from the others. But she was different, in a way that mattered enormously. Where the earlier women had adored and indulged him, Wallis mastered him. She was cooler than they had been, more commanding, quicker to correct and to mock. And the prince responded to it with a devotion that startled everyone who saw it. The most powerful bachelor in the world, the man the whole earth adored, became before their eyes almost servile, anxious to please one woman, watchful of her moods, happiest when he was doing as she wished. It was a reversal of everything a royal romance was supposed to be, and the people around him found it unsettling to witness. He deferred to her in public and in private. He seemed to shrink in her presence into something smaller and more eager, a man defined entirely by his need for her approval. Observers noted with unease how completely she governed him, how the roles of prince and subject seemed almost inverted when the two of them were together. Whatever it was that bound him to her, it was total, and it left no room for anything else. Not his family, not his duty, not the crown that was coming to him. It fitted in its way the pattern of his whole emotional life, only carried now to its furthest and most dangerous point. He had always sought the strong, married, managing woman who would take him in hand, and in Wallis he found the strongest and most managing of them all. A woman who did not merely adore him, but ruled him, and to whom he surrendered himself completely. Where Frida Dudley Ward and Thelma Furness had soothed and indulged him, Wallis mastered him, and the mastery was the very thing that fixed him to her beyond any hope of release. The more she commanded, the more he needed her. The dependence that the household had watched with unease for 20 years had found, at last, the woman strong enough to make it total. And in doing so, it had walked him straight toward the one marriage the whole system existed to forbid. Baltimore had made her, and it had made her nothing that England could accept as a queen. She was American, which the old order distrusted. She was a commoner, which it could perhaps have forgiven, and she had been married before and was married still, which it could not forgive at all. For a woman with a living former husband and a second husband yet to be shed could not. By the law of the church, the king would be received as his wife, let alone crowned at his side. Every person who understood the Constitution understood this from the first, and understood too that the king appeared not to care, that he was moving toward the marriage with the blind determination of a man who had never in his life been refused anything he truly wanted. The collision was not a risk, it was a certainty. The only question was when. By 1934, she had displaced the last of her rivals, Thelma, Viscountess Furness, and stood alone as the woman in the prince's life. And here, the private matter began to shade into a public danger, because this was no ordinary heir taking a mistress, a thing the system had always quietly tolerated. This was the future supreme governor of the Church of England binding himself, heart and will, to a woman with one divorce behind her and a second marriage still to be dissolved, and making plain to those who knew him that he intended in time to marry her. In the England of that age, and in the church he would head, a twice-divorced woman with 2 living former husbands could not be received as queen. Everyone who understood the Constitution understood the collision that was coming. Everyone, it seemed, except the man rushing toward it. When his father died, and he became king in 1936, the private obsession became a crisis of state. Wallis began the legal process to end her second marriage, and the meaning of it was unmistakable. The new king intended to make this woman his wife, and to make her his queen, and he was prepared to use every power of the throne to do it. His ministers watched with growing alarm. His household, who had seen it coming for 2 years, watched with something closer to despair. The thing the family had dreaded through all the years of mistresses had arrived at last, magnified beyond anything they had imagined, and it now threatened not merely the dignity of the prince, but the stability of the crown itself. For a time, the machinery of deference held the secret, as it had held every other secret about him. The British newspapers, bound by the old conventions, printed nothing, so that the king carried on his affair in the plain sight of the world's press, while his own people remained entirely in the dark. Across the Channel and across the Atlantic, the story ran freely, in headlines and photographs, and travellers brought the foreign papers home, and the rumour spread by word of mouth through the drawing rooms and the clubs. But the great mass of the public knew nothing until almost the very end. It was one of the last triumphs of the old system of silence, a king conducting the romance that would cost him his throne, while the country that adored him was kept, for month after month, in ignorance of it. Inside the palace and the government, there was no such ignorance and no such calm. The men responsible for the crown watched the king move, week by week, toward the precipice, and could find no way to turn him. He would not be argued with. He would not be reasoned out of it. He had the whole confidence of a man who had always got his way, and he seemed genuinely unable to grasp that this want, unlike all his others, ran into a wall that would not move. His ministers began, quietly, to prepare for the worst, and his household, who had seen his character clearly for 20 years, understood before he did how it would end. He would be made to choose, and when the choice came, he would choose the woman, because the woman was the one thing in all the world he could not do without, and the crown, for all its weight and glory, had never truly been. It is worth being fair to Wallis here, because the story that followed would cast her as the villain of the piece, the scheming American who stole a king and broke a monarchy, and that is not quite just. She had not set out to be a queen, and there is real evidence that as the crisis deepened, she grew frightened of what was happening and would have drawn back if she could. The force driving the whole affair toward its ruin was not her ambition, but his obsession. It was he who would not let go, he who refused every compromise, he who insisted on the marriage against the advice of everyone and the plain arithmetic of the Constitution. She was the object of the obsession, not its author. And that distinction matters, because it places the responsibility exactly where it belongs, not on the woman he loved, but on the man who could not, even to save his throne, master the wanting of her. The abdication was his doing, start to finish, and the habit of blaming her for it was one more way of sparing him the judgment he had earned. What is most revealing, and most in keeping with everything the courtiers had long understood about him, is how little the wider consequences seemed to weigh on him. The empire, the church, the settled order of the monarchy, the wishes of his mother, the warnings of his ministers, the whole vast inheritance he had been born to protect. All of it he was prepared to set against the single fact of his want. He wanted Wallis, and he had spent his whole life wanting things and getting them, and he could not or would not grasp that this was the one want the system was built to refuse. The selfishness the household had watched for 20 years, the arranging of the entire world around his own desire, now reached its final and largest form. He would have her, whatever it cost. And the cost was about to be the highest a king can pay. Chapter 8. The throne he handed away. 11 months after he became king, he sat down and signed his crown away and told the nation it was for love. The crisis broke into the open in the autumn of 1936, when the silence of the British press finally cracked, and the country learned what the rest of the world already knew: that their new king meant to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. What followed was not a long war of argument, but a short, brutal collision between one man's want and the immovable structure of the state, and it was over in a matter of weeks. The mechanics of it were simple and merciless. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, the same man who had once agreed that the country might be better off if the prince broke his neck, now told the king plainly that the marriage was impossible. The government would not accept Wallis as queen. The dominions, consulted across the world, would not accept her either. A proposal was floated for a lesser sort of marriage, one in which Wallis would be his wife, but not his queen, and their children barred from the throne, and it too was rejected as unworkable. The choice was stripped down to its bare bones and placed before him. He could keep the throne, or he could marry the woman. He could not do both. For a man who had spent his life refusing to choose between his pleasures and his duties, it was the cruelest possible position, and he made his choice with a speed that shocked even those who knew him. He chose the woman. On the 10th of December, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, his private retreat, he signed the instrument of abdication, the document by which a king of England gave up his throne, and his brothers signed as witnesses. The following day, the abdication was confirmed by Act of Parliament, and the reign of Edward VIII, begun in such hope less than a year before, was over. He had held the ancient crown of England for 326 days. Set that number beside the length of the lives around him, and the recklessness of it comes clear. His father had reigned for a quarter of a century and given his health to it. His brother would reign for 15 years and be killed by the strain. His niece would one day reign for decade upon decade, and he had held the throne for 326 days, less than a single year, before laying it down for a marriage, a reign so brief he was never even crowned. The coronation that had been planned for him became instead the coronation of the brother who replaced him, the ceremony of his own kingship handed on unused. He had been raised for one purpose across 42 years of careful preparation, and he had discharged it in under a year and thrown it away. The document he signed at Fort Belvedere, his private retreat near Windsor, was witnessed by his brothers, an intimate and terrible family scene. The sons of the late king gathered to record in ink the ruin of the eldest's destiny. There was, by the accounts of those present, a strange lightness about him through the crisis, an eagerness to have it done, a man not agonizing over a tragedy, but hurrying toward a release. He had made his choice long before, in his heart, and the signing was merely the paperwork of a decision already taken. Where his family saw catastrophe, he seemed to see liberation. Where they mourned, he was, in his own way, almost impatient to begin his new life. It was the clearest possible sign of how little the thing he was surrendering had ever truly meant to him. This is the detail that the love story has always struggled to absorb. A man giving up the throne of his life, the destiny he had been raised for since the cradle, the crown his father and his grandfather had worn, might be expected to feel the loss of it keenly, to grieve even as he chose, to hesitate on the threshold of so enormous a renunciation. He did not. By every account, he was eager, relieved, almost gay, a man not tearing himself away from something precious, but slipping free of something he had never wanted to hold. And that tells the truth about the whole of his life more plainly than any speech. The crown had been a weight to him, not a treasure. The role had been a cage, not a calling. He had endured it because he had to, and the moment a door opened, he went through it without a backward glance, and the only thing he carried out with him was the woman and, before long, the grievance. The nation lost a king that day. The king felt he had lost nothing at all. That night, he spoke to the country and the empire by radio, in the broadcast that would fix the whole affair in the public mind forever after as a love story. He told his millions of listeners that he had found it impossible to go on, in his own words, without the help and support of the woman he loved. The woman he loved. It was a phrase built to melt hearts, and it did, then and for decades afterward, casting the whole abdication in the golden light of romance. A king who gave up everything for love. It is how the story has been told ever since. But the men who had watched him for 20 years heard something else underneath the beautiful words. The same thing they had always heard. A man placing his own desire above every obligation he had been born to carry, and dressing it, as he always could, in language the crowd would adore. The genius of the phrase was that it turned a dereliction into a sacrifice. To abandon your post in the middle of your duty is one thing. To give up a throne for love is quite another. And it was the second story, not the first, that the broadcast planted in the public mind and that has flowered there ever since. For decades afterward, the abdication would be remembered as one of the great romances of the century. The king who loved so deeply, he surrendered a crown, and the man himself would tend that version of the story as carefully as he tended everything about his own image. It cast him as the hero of his own tragedy rather than the author of everyone else's, and it spared him, in the telling, from the harder judgment that the facts invited. He had always known how to make the crowd feel what he wished it to feel. It was his one great gift, and he used it, at the very end of his reign, to write the ending he preferred. What the beautiful story left out was everyone who paid for it. It left out the shy brother now saddled with a crown that would break his health. It left out the sorrowing mother who would never forgive it. It left out the officials and the ministers scrambling to hold the monarchy steady through a blow it had not suffered in centuries. And it left out the plain, unromantic truth that the man at the centre had done exactly what his father and his secretary had always feared he would do: put himself first, at the last and greatest crossroads, exactly as he had put himself first at every smaller one before it. The love was real enough. So was the selfishness. The abdication was the moment the two became forever impossible to tell apart. For the monarchy, it was a catastrophe narrowly survived. The institution had been shaken as it had not been shaken in living memory, its head walking away from his post in the middle of his reign, and only the quiet dutifulness of the brother who took his place would steady it again. For the country, it was a shock that mingled sympathy with a colder judgment, and the colder judgment grew as the years passed. And for the man himself, it was the great hinge of his life, the moment that turned the most adored prince in the world into something with no name and no place, a former king, an ex-sovereign, a man who had held everything and let it fall. He seems to have believed, in that first flush of sacrifice, that he had bought something precious with the crown he surrendered, a life of love and freedom and ease. What he had actually bought was 35 years of exile, with nothing to do and no one to be. A long, slow emptying out of a life that had begun at the very summit of the world. He did not know it yet. On the night of the broadcast, he was, in his own mind, a romantic hero who had chosen love over power. The discovery of what he had really chosen would take the rest of his life, and it would begin, almost at once, with a squalid and revealing quarrel over money. a quarrel that would show the family, and eventually the world, exactly what kind of man had just given up their throne. Chapter 9. The fortune he hid from his brother. He pleaded near poverty to the brother he had just made king, and all the while he was sitting on a fortune he had buried out of sight. The abdication had barely been signed before the two brothers, the man who had given up the throne and the shy man who had been forced to take it, sat down to the grubby business of money. And it is here, in the fine print of the settlement, that the romantic hero of the broadcast disappears entirely, and the man the courtiers had always known steps into full view. For the story of the settlement is a story of concealment, of a former king lying to his own family about what he was worth in order to squeeze more out of them, and it is documented in a way that opinion cannot touch. On the very day the arrangements were being framed, in early December of 1936, a figure was agreed in principle, £25,000 a year, to be paid to the departing king for the rest of his life. In the money of that time it was a fortune, an income to keep a man in the greatest comfort for the whole of his days. But the payment rested on a condition that any honest man would have met without a thought. He was to make a full and truthful disclosure of his own private wealth, so that the family could see what he already had before deciding what more he needed. And it was on this simple point of honesty that the whole business turned rotten. For when he was asked what he was worth, the former king pleaded something close to poverty. He represented his private fortune as modest, claiming assets of only about £90,000, a sum that would make him, for a man of his position, very nearly hard up. On the strength of that claim, he negotiated and pressed, and asked for the security his supposed poverty required. There was only one difficulty. It was not true. When the family's advisors looked into the matter, they discovered that the poor, sacrificing ex-king was in fact sitting on a private fortune of over £1 million, more than 10 times what he had admitted to, a vast sum he had quietly built up and quietly hidden while asking his brother to keep him. Where had it come from? All through his years as heir, he had held the Duchy of Cornwall, the great landed estate that exists to fund the heir to the throne, and its rich income had flowed to him year after year through all the decades of his glamour. Much of that money, instead of being spent on the duties of his position, had been saved and salted away into a private hoard. A hoard that, in the judgment of the royal biographer Sarah Bradford, should by rights have reverted back to the royal coffers when he ceased to be the heir. He had, in effect, walked away from the throne with the throne's own money in his pockets, and then turned to the brother he had burdened with the crown, and asked to be supported as though he had nothing. Try to hold the sizes of these sums in the mind at once, because the gap between them is the whole measure of the man. He told his family he was worth about £90,000. He was, in fact, worth more than £1 million. The distance between the two figures, more than £900,000, was not a rounding error or an honest mistake about the value of some estate. It was a deliberate concealment, on a colossal scale, by a former king negotiating with his own brother in the days after he had cast himself before the whole world as a man giving up everything for love. The romantic hero of the broadcast, weeping into the microphone about the woman he loved, had days earlier been coldly understating his fortune by a factor of more than 10 in order to squeeze a larger income out of the brother he had just ruined. No single fact in the whole story does more to strip the gold from the legend. And the meanness did not end when the concealment was exposed. It hardened into the permanent condition of his exile. For the rest of his life, the former king believed himself hard done by over-money and pressed the point relentlessly. The letters went on for years, to his brother while he lived and to his brother's officials after, asking for more, complaining of the terms, insisting that he had been treated shabbily by a family that owed him better. A man sitting on a concealed fortune, drawing a tax-free income from the sale of the family estates and receiving a private allowance from the king on top, could still work himself into genuine grievance over money, could still feel, with perfect sincerity, that the world had cheated him. It was the same bottomless want the household had watched in the prince, the same conviction that whatever he had, he was owed more, carried now into middle age and old age and never once outgrown. When the truth of the concealed million came out, the new king was left in an impossible position, and the generous settlement collapsed. George VI, faced with a brother who had lied about his wealth to extract a life income, renounced the £25,000 a year that had been discussed. In its place, a different arrangement was worked out, more guarded and more grudging. The king bought from his brother the former king's life interest in the private royal estates of Balmoral and Sandringham, the family's own property rather than the property of the crown, at a valuation of £289,853. That sum, invested in war bonds, produced an income of about £10,144 a year, and it came to the Duke free of tax. On top of it, the king added, out of his own pocket, a personal allowance of some £11,000 a year, an allowance carefully framed to cease upon the king's own death, so that the debt would not pass to another generation. Lay the figures out in a row, and the scale of it becomes plain. A concealed fortune of over £1 million, a claimed worth of only £90,000, a payment of £289,853 for his interest in the private estates, an income of about £10,144 a year from that sum, and free of tax, an allowance of some £11,000 a year on top, and, in the background, a father's estate of some £3 million from which he received nothing and over which he brooded. These are the hard, documented numbers of the settlement, and every one of them points the same way, toward a man of enormous private wealth who had lied to secure more of it and who felt, at the end of the whole exercise, that he had been robbed. The concealment was not a lapse. It was the character, caught for once in figures that could be checked. This is why the quarrel over money matters so much to any honest account of the man. Most of the case against him rests on the testimony of others, on the judgments of courtiers and the memories of servants, and testimony can always be argued with, discounted as bias or snobbery or spite. The settlement cannot be argued with in the same way, because it is not a matter of opinion, but of arithmetic. A man either conceals a fortune from his brother, or he does not, and this man did. He either understates his wealth by a factor of 10 while pleading for support, or he does not, and this man did. The figures are cold, and they are checkable, and they say, without any need for interpretation, exactly what kind of man had just given up the throne. A man who would lie to his own family about money in the very hour he was posing to the world as a hero of sacrifice. Set the figures side by side, and the character of the man stands fully revealed. Here was a former king who had concealed more than £1 million of his own, who had received nearly £290,000 for his interest in the family estates, who drew a tax-free income and a brotherly allowance on top of all of it, and who had also, it should be said, received no share of his father's estate of some £3 million, a grievance he nursed alongside the rest. And still, through all the years that followed, he felt cheated. Still he asked for more. Still the letters and the messages came, pressing his brother and then his brother's officials for larger sums, better terms, further help. As though the world owed him a living it had somehow failed to provide. The man who had £1 million hidden away spent the rest of his life convinced he had been treated meanly, It is the purest distillation of everything the household had watched for decades: the bottomless want, the certainty of grievance, the conviction that the whole world existed to keep him comfortable. And it was about to be joined by a second grievance, deeper and more lasting even than money, that would poison the next 35 years. Chapter 10. A Nice Wedding Present. The letter that reached him days before his wedding granted him a royal title and denied the same title to his bride, and he never forgave it as long as he lived. By the spring of 1937, the former king had been given a new identity to replace the crown he had surrendered. By letters patent of the 8th of March that year, his brother created him His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor, a royal duke of the blood, entitled to be addressed as a Royal Highness and to take his place, in exile, as a prince of the house he had led. It was a generous act in its way, a means of giving the departed king a dignity to carry into his new life, but it carried within it a sting that would define everything that came after. For the grant of the royal style was made to him, and to him alone. On the 27th of May, 1937, a few days only before his wedding, fresh letters patent settled the matter beyond doubt. The Duke of Windsor was His Royal Highness. His wife would not be. The style would be his and would not extend to the woman he was about to marry, nor to any children they might have. Wallis, who by every ordinary rule of English life should have taken her husband's rank as a wife takes it everywhere, was to be denied it by the deliberate act of the king. She would be the Duchess of Windsor. She would never, in the eyes of the crown, be Her Royal Highness. The legal ground for it was thin, and lawyers have argued over it ever since. The ordinary rule, older than anyone could remember, was that a wife shared her husband's status, that the wife of a royal highness was a royal highness in her turn. To deny it required an argument that the abdication had somehow stripped the former king of his royal rank altogether, so that when his brother restored it, he could restore it on whatever narrow terms he chose, to the man, but not to his wife. It was clever, and it was widely thought to be dubious, a piece of legal engineering built to reach a result the family had already decided upon. And the result they had decided upon was plain enough. They would not have Wallis Simpson made a royal highness. The king's own blunt private words captured the feeling behind the lawyering, a question of whether she was a fit and proper person to become a royal highness after what she had done in this country. Behind the legal reasoning lay a plain family calculation, and it was not made out of pure spite. The family had watched this woman draw their king away from his throne, had seen the damage done to the monarchy by the whole affair, and had no wish to reward the cause of it with the highest style the crown could bestow. To their minds, she had done real harm to the institution, and the harm was not to be answered with an honour. So they drew the line. He might have his royal rank as a gesture toward the brother he had been, but she would not share it, and the fiction that the abdication had stripped and then restored his status was the instrument they used to draw that line in law. It was cold, and it was calculated, and to the Duke, it was unforgivable. His response revealed, more sharply than anything else in the whole story, where his true priorities lay. He had surrendered the crown of a great empire with, by all accounts, remarkably little visible anguish, hurrying almost eagerly toward the exit. Yet the denial of 3 letters of style to his wife wounded him to the depths and stayed raw for the rest of his life. He wrote and protested and argued. He clung to the sense of betrayal, repeating that his brother had given him a promise and broken it, that he had been assured there would be no trouble over the title, and then ambushed with this. The throne he could shrug off in an afternoon. The slight to Wallis he would carry, burning, into old age and to the grave. It is one of the strangest orderings of value in the whole history of the monarchy, and it tells the truth about him that all his charm was designed to hide. What he could not endure was the sense of being slighted, of being made less, of not receiving the exact due he felt was owed. That, and not power, and not duty, was the thing he truly cared about. To the Duke, it was the deepest wound of his life, deeper than the loss of the throne itself, and his reaction to it tells more about him than almost anything else in his story. He did not accept it. He raged against it. He called the denial a nice wedding present, the bitterness curdling in the phrase. He protested, again and again, that his brother had betrayed a promise, crying out that his brother had promised him there would be no trouble over the title that he had promised him. He regarded the slight to his wife as a great insult, an act of cruelty aimed at the woman he loved, and he set his whole considerable stubbornness against it. He would not bow to it. He would fight it, in his way, for the rest of his life. The cruelty of it, as he saw it, was aimed not at him, but at her, and this was the part he could never accept. By every ordinary rule of English life, a wife took her husband's rank as naturally as she took his name. The wife of a duke was a duchess. The wife of a royal highness, without question or exception. That his own wife should be singled out, alone among all the wives in the kingdom, and denied the rank that the humblest of them would have received automatically, struck him as a deliberate humiliation, a public branding of Wallace as unworthy, delivered by his own family in the very week of his wedding. He was not entirely wrong to feel the sting of it. The denial was pointed, and it was meant to be understood. Where he went wrong was in what he did with the wound, which was to build his whole remaining life around it rather than lay it down. For the grievance would not stay a private grief. It became a policy, a principle, an organizing cause. He resolved that if the crown would not grant his wife her rank, then he would compel the recognition by every means within his own control, and would withhold himself from the country and the family until they relented. It was the decision of a proud and stubborn man, and it would shape the next 3.5 decades as surely as the abdication itself. He had lost the throne in a single dramatic act. He would lose his family, slowly, over a lifetime, to the endless small war over 2 letters of style, a war he could not win and would not stop fighting. And here the strangeness of the man comes fully into view. He had given up an empire, walked away from the ancient throne of England, surrendered a role that millions had adored him in, and done it all, he said, for love and for freedom. Yet he could not let go of 2 small letters of rank for his wife. The throne he could abandon in an afternoon. The 3 initials of a royal style he would clutch at, grieve over, and quarrel about until he died. It is a revealing order of priorities, and it exposes the truth beneath the romance. What he could not bear was not the loss of power, which he had never much wanted to exercise, but the sense of a slight, the feeling that he and his wife were being looked down upon, denied their proper due, made less than they ought to be. The grievance was the thing. The grievance was almost the whole of him. He made his stand at once, before the marriage had even taken place, and he never came down from it. He let it be known that he would not return to live in England, while his wife was denied the rank he thought was hers. He built his household, as the next years would show, into a small court dedicated to pretending the denial had never happened, and he carried the wound of it into every dealing with his family for the next 3.5 decades, so that no reconciliation, however kindly meant, could ever quite succeed, because the thing he wanted was the one thing they would not give. The money quarrel had shown the world his greed. The quarrel over the title would show it his pettiness, stretched out across a lifetime, and turned into a way of living. Chapter 11. The bow she was never owed. Inside his own house, He built a small kingdom of protocol to sustain a rank the crown had refused to grant. If the King of England would not make Wallis a royal highness, then the Duke of Windsor would make her one within the four walls of his own household by main force of will, and he set about it with a seriousness that would have been touching had it not been so revealing. The denial of the style became the organizing principle of his domestic life. A wound he dressed and redressed every single day by insisting that everyone around him behave as though the wound did not exist. The servants were instructed in it. Within the Windsor household, the Duchess was to be addressed with the full honours the Crown had withheld, spoken of and spoken to as Her Royal Highness, or in the French of their adopted country as Son Altesse Royale. The very words the letters patent had been written to forbid. The staff learned to give her the style in private that she could never carry in public, and the household ran on the polite fiction that a royal highness lived at its centre. It was a rank conjured out of loyalty and stubbornness, real only inside those rooms. And the Duke defended it there, as fiercely as any king ever defended a border. Guests were drawn into the performance too. Those who came to the Windsor table were expected to observe the forms, to bow and to curtsy to the Duchess as they would to a princess of the blood, to grant her in the drawing-room the deference the state had denied her in law. Some did it willingly, out of affection or a wish to please. Others found it faintly absurd, this insistence on royal ceremony from a couple with no throne, no country, and no official standing of any kind, a former king playing at court in a rented house. But the Duke did not find it absurd. To him, it was the most serious matter in the world, the daily correction of a great injustice, and a visitor who failed to bow to his wife could expect to find the temperature of the room drop sharply. There was something both sad and telling in the sheer scale of the effort. Here was a man who had thrown away real power without apparent regret, and who now spent his energy, day after day, year after year, enforcing an imaginary version of the very rank he had discarded. The substance of monarchy he had let fall in an afternoon. The shadow of it he pursued for the rest of his life. He could not rule a country, and did not wish to, but he could rule that his wife be curtsied to at dinner, and that small, unwinnable battle became the great cause of his exile. The pettiness the household had watched in the young prince had found, in the denied title, its perfect and permanent object. To visitors, it could seem almost a private theatre, staged nightly in the drawing-rooms of France for an audience of one. The former king would watch keenly to see whether a newcomer gave his wife the bow or the curtsy he demanded for her, and the warmth of the whole evening would turn upon it. Those who obliged were rewarded with his considerable charm, still potent even in exile. Those who forgot or declined found the air grow cold. It was, in its way, a strange inversion of everything a monarchy is supposed to be. The real thing draws its power from being recognized by a whole nation, effortlessly, as a matter of settled fact. This was a rank recognized nowhere but in one household, sustained only by the will of the man who insisted on it, requiring his constant vigilance to maintain. The more fiercely he defended it, the more plainly it revealed that it did not really exist. And the strangeness ran deeper still, into the question of what he had actually wanted all along. He had told the world he wanted love and freedom, and had given up a throne to have them. But a man truly content with love and freedom does not spend the following decades enforcing an imaginary court in a rented house. The energy he poured into the business of his wife's rank suggested a man who missed, badly, the deference and the standing he had thrown away, who wanted the trappings of the royalty he had renounced, even as he insisted he had renounced it gladly. He had given up the substance and could not give up the shadow. He had walked away from the crowds and the crown, and then spent his life trying to reconstruct, in miniature, the reverence they had once given him, around the one person the crown had refused to bow to, and it poisoned everything it touched. Every gesture of reconciliation from his family, every tentative approach across the years, ran aground on the same rock. He would consider coming closer, coming home, mending the breach, but always on the one condition they would never meet: that his wife be recognized, received, and granted her rank. Because they would not, he would not, and so the estrangement hardened and set. His mother, Queen Mary, who had never approved of the marriage, never received Wallace at all, refusing to the end of her life to meet the woman for whom her son had abandoned his throne. Mother and son, who had once been close in their contained and dutiful way, ended as strangers, and the denied title stood between them like a wall neither would climb. There is a bitter irony folded into the whole business that he seems never quite to have grasped. In fighting so relentlessly for his wife's dignity, he condemned her to a life of exile and estrangement far harder than any denied initials could have made it. Had he let the matter drop, accepted the terms, and brought Wallace quietly home, she might in time have won a place, however modest, in the family and the country. Instead, by making her rank the price of every reconciliation, he ensured that she remained forever the outsider, the woman his family would not receive, shut out of England and cut off from any real standing for the rest of her days. He believed he was defending her. He was, in truth, chaining her to his own grievance, and the great romance for which a throne had been given up curdled over the years into a long joint sentence of exile, served in comfort, but served nonetheless. The wound he would not let heal was hers to bear as much as his. The tragedy of it was that the thing he was fighting for was, in the end, almost worthless in practice. Wallace would never live in England, would never move in the court that might have used the style, would never have any real occasion to carry the rank he grieved for so bitterly. It was a point of pure principle, a matter of pride and hurt and the sense of a slight, and he sacrificed 35 years of possible peace with his family upon it. He might have had his brother's warmth, his mother's forgiveness, a way back to the country he had led. He chose the grievance instead, again and again, because the grievance had become the thing he could not live without. He had given up a kingdom and kept a wound, and he tended the wound as other men tend a garden, and it grew. There is a kind of person for whom a sense of injury becomes, over time, the organizing fact of life, more precious than any pleasure and harder to give up than any comfort, because it explains everything and demands nothing. The grievance told him he was the wronged party, the loyal husband defending his slighted wife against a cold and cruel family, and that story was far more flattering than the truth, which was that he had thrown away a throne on a whim and could not bear the consequences. So he held to the grievance as a drowning man holds to a spar, because to let it go would have meant looking honestly at what he had done and at what he was, and that was the one thing, in all his life, he could never quite bring himself to do. The denied title was not really about Wallace at all in the end. It was about him, about his need to be in the right, to be the injured one, to be owed. It was the last and largest form of the selfishness the household had watched from the very beginning, dressed now as devotion, and it lasted him to the grave. Chapter 12. A king with nowhere to go. He married her in a French chateau with not one member of his family in the room, and then discovered that he had nowhere in the world to be. The wedding took place on the 3rd of June, 1937, at the Château de Conde in the French countryside, a private affair in a borrowed house, far from the abbeys and cathedrals where the marriages of his family had always been made. It was the day he had given up a throne to reach, the union for which he had paid the highest price a king can pay. And it was attended, on his side, by no one. Not his mother, not his brother the king. Not a single member of the royal house he had led came to see him married. They stayed away, and their absence hung over the small ceremony like a verdict. That empty pew said everything the family could not say aloud. A royal wedding is, by its nature, a gathering of the dynasty, a public declaration that the house stands united behind the union. This was the opposite. A wedding the house refused to attend. A marriage the family would not bless with its presence. The king did not come. His mother did not come. Not one of them came. The message was unmistakable, and it was meant to be received. They would tolerate the marriage because they could not prevent it, but they would not endorse it, and they marked their refusal by staying away from the most important day of his life. He had chosen Wallace over all of them, and now, on his wedding day, all of them chose to be absent. The estrangement that would last 35 years was declared in silence by the empty seats in a French chateau. And so, he entered the married life he had paid a crown for, and found waiting for him not the golden freedom he had imagined, but a vast and echoing emptiness. He had spent his entire life at the centre of things, watched, courted, needed, his every hour claimed by the business of being who he was. Now, at a stroke, no one needed him at all. There were no duties, no papers, no engagements, no country to serve, no role of any kind. The most famous man in the world had become a man with nothing to do, and the days that had once been too full stretched out before him, hour after empty hour, for the rest of his life. He had wanted to be free of the burden. He discovered that the burden had also been the meaning, and that without it he was, for all his charm and all his money, a man with no purpose left on earth. He had what he had wanted. He had Wallace, and he had his freedom, and he had a great deal of money, whatever his complaints about it. What he did not have, and would never again have, was a purpose. For his entire life until that afternoon, every hour had been shaped by the fact of his position, the tours, the duties, the crowds, the endless business of being the most watched man in the world. Now, at a stroke, all of it was gone. There were no boxes to read, no engagements to keep, no country to serve, no role to fill. The busiest ceremonial life on earth had been exchanged for one of the emptiest, and the man who had complained so bitterly about the weight of duty now found himself with no weight to carry at all, and no idea what to do with the lightness. The early years of the marriage passed in a kind of glamorous drifting. The couple moved between hotels and rented houses, entertained and were entertained, travelled, shopped, dined, and filled the days as best they could. The upheavals of the war years took them for a time to a posting far from Europe, and when the peace returned, they gravitated, as so many of the rootless rich did, toward France, where a former king could live handsomely and quietly and be left alone. But wherever they went, the essential fact of the exile did not change. There was nothing for him to do. He was a former king in a world that had no use for former kings, a man trained for one role and one role only, and stripped of it forever at the age of 42. There is no precedent in the modern history of the country for the position he now occupied. And that was part of the problem. A king who dies is mourned and replaced, and his memory takes its honoured place in the long line. A king who is deposed is a martyr or a villain, a figure the story knows how to hold. But a king who simply resigns, who walks away in good health and full possession of his faculties, and then lives on for decades in a foreign country, is something the system has no settled place for. He was not dead, and not deposed, and not reigning, and not needed. A living former sovereign with no function and no home. An awkward ghost at the edge of the family he had abandoned. The very novelty of his situation left him stranded. There was no role marked out for such a man, because such a man had scarcely existed before, and so he drifted into the one condition that was always available to the very rich, a life of expensive, ornamental idleness, and there he stayed. He made, in these years, the occasional attempt to find a place for himself, some position or purpose that might give the empty days a shape. Nothing ever came of it. The family did not want him back in any role that mattered, wary of his judgment and weary of his grievances. The governments that might have used him had no obvious task for a man in his strange position, and the Duke himself, for all his complaints of idleness, had never in his life shown the steadiness that real work requires, the very quality the household had found missing in him from the start. So the attempts faded, and the idleness settled in for good, and the shape of the rest of his life became clear. It would be long and comfortable, and completely without meaning. What makes these years so strange to contemplate is the contrast with everything that had gone before. This was the man whom 2 continents had adored, whose every gesture had been copied, whose face had sold 1,000 newspapers, who had stood at the very centre of the world's attention for the better part of 2 decades. And now the attention was gone, drained away almost overnight, and what was left was a small, elegant, aimless life in borrowed and rented rooms, a former king filling time. The crowds had moved on. The cameras had turned elsewhere. The legend had frozen into history. And the man who had been the legend was left to live out the long remainder in a quiet that must, at times, have been deafening. The cruelty of it, if it can be called that, was one he had inflicted entirely upon himself. He had not been cast out by enemies or brought down by misfortune. He had walked, of his own free will, out of the fullest life the world could offer and into the emptiest, and he had done it in the belief that he was trading a burden for a joy. The joy, such as it was, he had, the woman at his side for the rest of his days. But the burden he had shed turned out to have been the very thing that gave his hours their weight, and without it, the days did not feel like freedom. They felt like exile, which is what they were. A man can only enjoy rest when he has earned it by labour, and can only savour leisure against the memory of work. This was leisure without end and without contrast, rest that had never been earned and would never be interrupted, and it stretched ahead of him, year upon identical year, in the beautiful rooms of a country not his own. He had chosen this. That is the hard centre of it. No one had exiled him, no one had stripped him of his life against his will. He had weighed the throne against the woman, and chosen the woman, weighed his duty against his desire, and chosen his desire, exactly as the household had always known he would. And the reward for the choice was this: a gilded emptiness stretching out across the years, a life with everything in it except a reason. He did not yet fully understand what he had done. That understanding, if it ever came, would come slowly, in the long Paris afternoons that lay ahead, in a beautiful house at the edge of a great wood, where the most charming prince the century had produced would grow old with nothing left to charm. Chapter 13. The Gilded Cage in the Bois de Boulogne. The city of Paris handed a former king a mansion at the edge of a great wood for almost nothing, and there he arranged a life of beautiful, expensive nothing. From 1953, the Windsors made their main home in a grand house on the route du Champ d'Entraînement, on the fringe of the Bois de Boulogne, the vast park on the western edge of Paris. The house was leased to them by the city itself, at a rent so low it was little more than a formality, a quiet favour from the French state to the man who had once been King of England. And within it, the couple built the strange, ornamental, and entirely purposeless existence that would fill the rest of their years. The house became famous for its style, which was the Duke and Duchess's one great creation and their one remaining occupation. Every detail of it was considered, arranged, and perfected. The furniture, the flowers, the table settings, the liveried servants, the whole apparatus of a royal household reproduced in miniature for a couple with no realm. It was run to a standard of ceremony that visitors found astonishing. A near-royal formality maintained around 2 people whose only subjects were their staff and their small dogs. Nothing was casual. Nothing was left to chance. The arrangement of a dinner table could occupy the Duke for an afternoon, and did, because the arrangement of a dinner table was very nearly all he had left to arrange. Beyond the Paris house there was a country retreat, a converted mill called the Moulin de la Tuilerie, at Gif-sur-Yvette, to the southwest of the city, where the couple spent their weekends and their summers. There the Duke gardened, which was the closest thing to a genuine occupation he ever found in exile. A man who had governed an empire on paper now bent over flower beds, tending a patch of French earth with the same care he might once have been expected to give to affairs of state. It was a harmless pleasure, and a quietly poignant one. The great inheritor reduced to the pleasures of any comfortable retired gentleman, filling his hours with the small satisfactions of a private life, because there was no public life left for him to lead. The arrangement by which he came to hold the Paris house tells its own quiet story about what he had become. He did not buy it, and he did not, in any real sense, rent it. The city of Paris made it available to him at a rent so low as to be almost symbolic, a courtesy extended by the French state to a man who had once worn a crown, a gesture of respect toward a rank he no longer held. He lived, in other words, on the kindness of others, housed at a favor, granted the mansion much as he had been granted so many things across his life, because of who he had been rather than anything he now did. And he accepted it, as he had always accepted such things, as no more than his due. The former king who felt cheated over money took the near-free use of a Paris mansion as simply the way the world ought to treat a man like him. Within its walls, he and the Duchess assembled a way of living that was, in its own strange fashion, a kind of full-time occupation, the only one they had. The house had to be perfect, and keeping it perfect consumed them. The flowers were changed and arranged with enormous care. The table was laid with a precision that visitors found astonishing. The servants were drilled, the menus considered, the guest lists weighed. The whole elaborate machinery of a grand household maintained at a pitch of formality that would have suited a working court. It gave the days a shape, this endless tending of a beautiful surface, and it filled the hours that had nothing else to fill them. But it was, when all was said, the management of appearances and nothing more, the arranging and rearranging of a life that had no purpose beyond its own display. He had once helped to run an empire. Now he ran a dinner table, and ran it as though the fate of nations turned upon the placement of the forks. The scale of the luxury that surrounded this emptiness was extraordinary, and it can be measured. The house at the edge of the wood was so grand that when it was let again, years later, after the Duchess had died, the new tenant agreed to pay 1 million francs a year for it, and to spend a further 30 million francs restoring it to its proper state, a sum that gives some sense of what such a place cost to keep. The Duchess's jewels, the glittering collection the Duke lavished upon her across the decades, were sold at auction after her death for more than $50 million, one of the greatest hoards of personal jewellery ever to come to market. The clothes, the objects, the monogrammed everything, the whole shining surface of the Windsor life, spoke of money spent without limit and without purpose, on the ornamenting of a life that had nothing at its core to ornament. For that was the truth the beauty concealed. Behind the perfect table settings and the famous style and the priceless jewels there was, at the centre of it all, a profound and permanent boredom. The Duke had exchanged the throne of England for a life of arranging flowers and walking dogs and dressing for dinners that led nowhere. And no amount of luxury could fill the space where a purpose should have been. He had wanted freedom, and freedom had turned out to mean the freedom to do nothing that mattered, forever. The house in the Bois de Boulogne was as beautiful as money could make it, and it was, for the man who lived in it, a kind of cage, gilded to the last inch, from which there was no release but death. The measure of a life is what it is for, and this life was for nothing. He rose and dressed, and saw to the small business of the household, and golfed, or gardened, or received a visitor, and dined, and went to bed, and rose again, and the pattern repeated, unchanging, across the decades, leading nowhere and building nothing. There were no children to raise, no work to complete, no cause to serve, no country that needed him. The great engine of his early life, the sense that he mattered, that his hours counted, that a whole world turned on what he did, had been switched off at the age of 42 and never turned on again. What remained was comfort without meaning, luxury without purpose, a long, soft, beautiful nothing, and he lived inside it for the rest of his days, growing older among the flowers and the jewels and the little dogs, a former king waiting out the years in a borrowed house at the edge of a wood. The contrast with the life he had left could hardly have been sharper, and he must have felt it in the long afternoons, however carefully he kept it from his face. He had been the busiest man in the empire, his diary filled months in advance, his every hour claimed by some duty or ceremony or crowd. Now the diary was empty, and stayed empty, and the great skill of his life, the ability to charm a room and command a crowd, had nowhere left to be used. The gift was still there. There was simply no one left to give it to, beyond the same small circle of guests and servants and the woman across the table, who had all seen it many times before. A talent that had once moved millions was spent at the end on the arrangement of a dinner and the greeting of a weekend guest. And the man who had held the attention of the world sat in his beautiful rooms with no one much to notice him, tending his flowers, dressing with care, and waiting. The people who saw the couple most closely, the visitors and the hosts, and above all the servants who lived alongside them, understood this better than anyone. And it is in their accounts that the real texture of the exile survives. They watched the Duke fill his empty days with the tiny tyrannies of the idle rich, the fuss over detail, the obsession with small perfections, the long, aimless afternoons. And they came, many of them, to a conclusion about the man at the centre of it all that echoed, across the decades and the miles, the very verdict his private secretary had reached in the 1920s. Nothing had changed. The prince had become the duke, the palace had become the villa, and the hollow at the centre was exactly where it had always been. Chapter 14. The Emperor of Small Things. With no kingdom left to rule, he ruled the only thing he had, the tiny details of his own comfort, and the people who served him watched the boredom set in and never lift. The Windsor household ran on the labour of a devoted staff, and one of them, more than any other, became the quiet witness to the long exile. His name was Sidney Johnson, a young man from the Bahamas who had first entered the Duke's service around the beginning of the 1940s, when the Duke was posted for a time to the islands, and who followed him afterward to Paris and served him there as footman and then as valet for more than 30 years. Johnson was with him almost to the end, one of the closest and most constant presences of his whole exile, and he remembered a master whose life had shrunk to the compass of his own small wants. For a man who had once commanded the attention of the world, the Duke's daily concerns had become astonishingly small. He was famously exact about his clothes, the great arbiter of style still fussing in old age over the precise knot of a tie and the exact hang of a jacket, as though the correct dressing of himself were a matter of real importance. He was particular about the ordering of his household, the running of his rooms, the arrangement of his effects, attentive to detail in a way that spoke of a mind with nothing larger to occupy it. He doted on his little dogs, the pug dogs that shared the house and travelled with the couple, and received, some observers thought, a good deal more warmth than most human beings ever drew from him. And around these small things, the ties and the dogs and the dinner tables and the flower beds, his whole life now turned. Sidney Johnson watched it all, year upon year, with the particular clear sight of the servant who sees the master unguarded. He had come to the Duke as a very young man, half a world from home, and he stayed with him for more than 3 decades, through the whole long middle and end of the exile, close enough to know the daily reality behind the famous style. He served at the formal dinners in his livery, and he dressed the Duke, and he tended to the endless small requirements of a man who cared enormously about the details of his own comfort and had little else to care about. What he witnessed was not the golden prince of legend, but an aging, exacting, faintly melancholy figure, fussing over his clothes and his dogs in a beautiful house, going through the motions of a grand existence that had emptied out long ago. He remained devoted to the Duke to the end, and beyond it. But devotion did not blind him to what he saw, which was a life shrunk almost to nothing. The saddest part was how little seemed to have changed since the beginning, how completely the man had failed to grow. The prince the courtiers had known in the 1920s had been self-absorbed, restless, and hungry to be indulged. A grown man with something childlike and unfinished at his core. The Duke of the Paris years was the same man exactly, only older. The same restlessness now with nowhere to go. The same need to have everything just so now spent on ties and table settings. The same strange hollowness that Lascelles had named so long ago as the want of a soul. Age had not deepened him. Suffering had not deepened him. The abdication, the exile, the estrangement, the long years of reflection, none of it had worked any change in the essential man. He had begun as a gifted, empty boy, and he was ending as a gifted, empty old man, and the whole vast drama of his life had left the centre of him exactly as it had always been. It was, in its way, a portrait of a rested life, the same man the courtiers had known in his prime, grown old, but not grown up. The restlessness had not left him, only shrunk to fit the tiny stage of his exile. The need to have things exactly as he wished, which had once inconvenienced governments, now inconvenienced only his valet. The childlike quality that Lascelles had named so long ago, the sense of a man who had been given every gift except a soul, had not been cured by age or by suffering, or by the long years of reflection. If anything, the emptiness was plainer now than it had ever been, no longer hidden behind the dazzle of a great position, but exposed in the small, fussy, aimless routines of a man with nothing left to be. The boredom was the deepest note of all, and everyone who spent time in the house came to feel it. The days had a terrible sameness, the mornings and the afternoons and the evenings folding into one another with nothing to distinguish them, no work, no duty, no purpose to lend them shape. The Duke golfed and gardened and dressed and dined, and the years went by, and beneath the elegant surface there was the slow, grinding emptiness of a life with nowhere to go. Guests sometimes came away moved by it, this once dazzling figure marooned in comfort, going through the motions of a grand life that had lost all its meaning. He had reached, at the summit of his youth, the highest place in the world. He had come to rest, in his age, as the emperor of small things, ruler of a household, master of a dinner table, sovereign of nothing. Visitors who came to the house carried the impression away with them, and it was almost always the same impression of a great glamour gone strangely hollow. They arrived expecting the legend, the king who gave up his throne for love, and they found instead an elderly couple in a museum of their own past, keeping up appearances in beautiful rooms, going through the forms of a grandeur that had lost all its substance. The talk turned often to the old grievances, the money, the title, the wrongs he felt his family had done him, worn grooves of complaint he had been running for 30 years. There was charm still when he chose to show it. The old gift never quite deserted him. But beneath it, the guests sensed the emptiness, the sheer purposelessness of the days, and many came away moved and a little chilled by the sight of so much given up for so little, a throne exchanged for this, a life of ornament and grievance in a rented house. And the Duchess, for whom he had done it all, was aging beside him into her own decline. The great romance that had cost a throne had settled, as all things in that house settled, into routine. The two of them growing old together in the beautiful rooms, bound by habit and history and the long-shared exile. Whatever the marriage had been at its height, whatever fire had once burned hot enough to consume a crown, the years had banked it down to something quieter. Two people at the end of a long, strange road, with only each other and the servants and the little dogs for company. The world that had once hung on their every move had almost forgotten they were alive. They were not entirely forgotten, of course. They remained figures of fascination, the couple who had given up a throne for love, and the legend of the romance kept a certain glamour about them to the end. But the fascination was with the story, the abdication, the sacrifice, the love that changed history, and the story had ended decades before. The living couple in the house in the Bois de Boulogne were its long, slow epilogue, and the epilogue was mostly silence. The Duke was an old man now, thin and worn, still exact about his ties, still doting on his dogs, still, somewhere underneath, nursing the old grievances about money and rank that had never left him, and the illness that would end him was already at work, quietly, in his throat, the price of a lifetime of cigarettes, moving him toward the last act of all, the one in which the family that had shut him out would finally, at the very end, open the door. Chapter 15. The Brother Who Paid the Price. The shy brother who took the crown he threw away did his duty and was dead at 56, while the man who caused it all lived on and on. It is impossible to weigh the Duke of Windsor's long, comfortable, empty exile without setting beside it the fate of the brother who had to clean up what he left behind. For the contrast between the two men is the whole moral of the story, drawn in the plainest possible terms. George VI had never wanted the throne, never expected it, never been prepared for it. He was a shy man with a bad stammer, happiest in his family and his home, and the crown was thrust upon him in the middle of his life by an older brother who could not be bothered to carry it. He took it up, and it killed him. He reigned for 15 years, through the worst war in the history of the world, and he did it not with charm, which he lacked, but with duty, which he had in full measure. Where his brother had dodged the boxes and shortened the engagements and treated the role as a set of privileges to enjoy, George VI bent himself to the work, mastered his stammer well enough to speak to his people when they needed him most, and gave the whole of his strength to the position he had never sought. It aged him, and it wore him down, and it broke his health, and in 1952, at the age of only 56, he died, worn out in the service of a crown that had been meant for someone else. He had done his brother's duty as well as his own. and it had cost him his life. The arithmetic of it is brutal and worth stating plainly. The brother who did the duty died at 56. The brother who ran from it lived to 77. The one who took up the weight was crushed by it young, and the one who laid it down grew old in comfort in a French villa, gardening and fussing over his ties, nursing his grievances about money and rank. There could be no clearer illustration of what the throne actually costs the person who serves it honestly, and of how completely the Duke of Windsor had escaped that cost by refusing the service. He had kept his freedom and his health and his long years, and his brother had paid for them, and there is no evidence that the Duke ever fully understood, still less regretted, the exchange. The younger brother had never wanted any of it, and that is what makes the sacrifice so complete. He had been the spare, the shy one, the boy with the crippling stammer who had been happy to stand in the shadow of his dazzling elder and expected to remain there all his life. He had a home he loved, and a family he adored, and a quiet nature entirely unsuited to the blaze of the throne, and he had every reason to believe none of it would ever be disturbed. And then, without warning and against his will, the whole weight of the monarchy was dropped upon him by a brother who could not be troubled to carry it, and he had to become, overnight, the king of a great empire on the edge of the most terrible war in history. He had never wanted it, and dreaded the prospect. He took it up regardless, because there was no one else, and because duty, to him, was not a burden to be dodged, but a debt to be paid, and he paid it in full, to the last of his strength. The war made his reign, and it also consumed him. Through the long years of it, he stayed with his people, sharing the danger, steadying the nation, forcing his reluctant tongue to speak to a frightened country when it needed a voice. He had none of his brother's easy charm, and so he had to build, out of sheer effort and will, the connection that had come to the elder man for nothing. And he did build it, and the country came to love him for it, precisely because they could see what it cost him. But the cost was real, and it was mortal. The strain of the throne and the war aged him beyond his years, wore down his health, and brought him, in 1952, to an early grave, dead at 56 of the illnesses that a life of duty had helped to bring on. He had done his brother's job and his own, and it had killed him, while the brother who had handed it to him gardened on in France. Their mother lived to see it all. Queen Mary, who had watched her eldest son abandon his throne and never forgiven it, who had refused to the end to receive the woman he married, endured the death of her second son, the dutiful one, in 1952, and followed him to the grave herself the next year, in 1953. She died as she had lived, magnificent and dutiful and sorrowing, having never once met her daughter-in-law, the estrangement between herself and her eldest son unhealed to the last. The wall that the denied title had built between mother and son stood to the very end. She went to her grave without the reconciliation, and so did he, and the grievance he had chosen over her forgiveness outlived them both. Think of what that estrangement cost, measured against what caused it. A mother and her firstborn son, who had once been close, spent the last 17 years of her life as strangers, never meeting, the breach never healed, and all of it turned on his refusal to come home unless his wife was granted a style she would never have used. He could have had his mother back. He could have sat with her, been forgiven, made his peace before she died. The price was only that he set aside the grievance over the title, and he would not pay it, not even for his own mother, not even at the very end. He chose the wound over the woman who had borne him, exactly as he had chosen it over his brother and his country. The pettiness that the household had first noticed in a spoiled young prince had grown, across a lifetime, into something that could stand between a man and his dying mother and win. For the family, The years after the war settled into a long, careful management of the awkward figure in Paris. He was kept at a distance, invited rarely, handled with caution, a former king who could not be entirely ignored and could not be comfortably embraced, forever pressing at the edges for the one recognition they would not grant. The letters still came, about money, about the title, about the endless sense of grievance. The requests still had to be considered and mostly refused. And always, at the centre of every dealing, sat the immovable fact of the denied style, the thing he would not stop wanting and they would not agree to give, holding the whole family at arm's length across the Channel, year after year after year. Only at the very end did the ice begin, at last, to thaw. As the Duke grew old and then grew ill, and the passions of the abdication faded into history, the new generation of the family, led by the young Queen who was his niece, found it possible to soften toward the exiled uncle in a way his mother and his brother never had. The grievances that had seemed so enormous in the 1930s looked smaller now, from the far side of a war and a quarter-century of peace, and a dying old man in Paris was easier to pity than a defiant former king had been to forgive. The door that had been shut for 35 years began, slowly, to open. And it would open fully in the end, only when it no longer mattered, in the last week of his life, and at his funeral, when the family came at last to gather up the brother they had lost so long before. Chapter 16. The King Brought Home. In the last week of May, 1972, the throat cancer finished him, and the family that had kept his wife out for 35 years finally opened the door. He died on the 28th of May, in the house at the edge of the Bois de Boulogne, an old man, worn down by illness and by a lifetime of cigarettes, 77 years old. The most photographed young man of his century, ended as a frail figure in a Paris bedroom, far from the country he had been born to rule, attended by his aging duchess and his devoted servants, the long exile closing at last in the quiet it had always threatened. He had reached the highest place in the world and come to rest in a rented house in a foreign city, and between the two lay the whole strange arc of his wasted inheritance. 10 days before the end, the door had begun to open. On the 18th of May, while she was in France on a state visit, the young Queen, his niece, called at the house in Paris to see her dying uncle. Elizabeth II came to his bedside, the reigning monarch paying her respects to the man who had once held her throne and thrown it away. And for a few minutes, the breach of 35 years was set aside in the face of death. It was the reconciliation that his mother and his brother had never managed in life, arriving at the very edge of the grave, a last human kindness offered to a man who had spent his exile convinced his family had wronged him. Within days, he was gone. His body was brought home to England at last, to the country that had adored him and then turned from him, and in death he was granted the ceremony that his life had forfeited. He lay in state in St. George's Chapel at Windsor for 3 days, and the people came, as they had always come for him, in their thousands. The queue to file past his coffin stretched half a mile down Castle Hill, and a great field was given over to the parking of 2,000 cars, and the ordinary men and women of the country he had left waited in the long line to pay their respects to the king who might have been. The crowds that had once filled the streets for the Golden Prince gathered one final time for the old man in the coffin, and then dispersed forever. There was a strange completeness to the honours that death restored to him. In life, the family had held him at arm's length for 35 years, had denied his wife her rank, had refused to receive her, had kept the awkward exile at a careful distance across the Channel. In death, he was gathered back without reservation into the fold he had left. He was brought home to Windsor, laid in state in the great chapel there, mourned by the sovereign and the whole royal house, and buried among his ancestors in the royal ground. The state that had no use for him alive gave him, dead, the full solemnity of a king's farewell. It was as though the family, unable to forgive the man while he lived, could at last embrace the memory once the difficult, grievance-ridden reality of him was safely gone. The door that had been shut for a lifetime opened only when there was no longer a living man to walk through it. And at the centre of the great occasion, bewildered and frail, sat the woman who was the reason for all of it. Wallace had come home to England at last, decades too late and under the worst of circumstances, to bury the husband for whom she had been blamed and shunned across the whole span of the exile. She was old now, and her mind was failing, clouded by the hardening of her arteries, and she moved through the ceremony in a fog, uncertain of the faces around her, frightened of the family she had never been allowed to join. The great romance of the century had come to this, an old, confused, grieving widow among strangers who were also, by marriage, her family, brought together at last over a coffin, at the one moment when the long war of the rank no longer meant anything to anyone. The funeral was held on the 5th of June, 1972, in the chapel at Windsor, beginning at 11:15 in the morning and lasting only 30 minutes. The Queen was there, and her husband, and the Queen Mother, and the wider family gathered to bury the exile in the fold at last. And in the middle of them, small and frail and bewildered, sat the woman for whom the whole vast tragedy had been set in motion, the Duchess of Windsor, brought to England for the first time in decades to bury her husband among the family that had never received her. She was old now, and failing, her mind clouded by the hardening of her arteries, and she moved through the great occasion in a fog of grief and confusion, uncertain of where she was and what was happening around her. The kindness that had been withheld from her for 35 years was granted at the very end. The Duchess, who had never been welcomed by the royal family across all the long years of the exile, was received as a guest at Buckingham Palace itself, housed under the roof of the family that had shut her out in the days around the funeral. She had been anxious, in her confusion, about facing the Queen Mother, the old adversary of the abdication and the denied title, the sister-in-law who had blamed her for everything. And it was Lord Mountbatten who reassured her, telling her gently that her sister-in-law would receive her with open arms, that she was deeply sorry for her in her grief, and remembered what it had been like when her own husband died. At the end, the enmity was laid down. The women who had circled each other across a lifetime of grievance met, finally, in sorrow. He was buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, in the grounds of the Windsor estate, in a private committal attended by only 14 people, the family gathering in a small and intimate circle to lay him finally to rest in the earth of home. The king who had exiled himself came back, in the end, to lie among his own, and the Duchess, when her own long widowhood ended 14 years later, in 1986, was buried beside him there, in the royal ground, granted in death the place at his side and inside the family that she had been denied in life. In her last years, the Queen had quietly granted her a modest allowance, a small provision from the Crown for the widow of the uncle who had caused so much grief, a last thread of duty binding the family to the woman at the centre of it all. They lie together now at Frogmore, the king who gave up everything and the woman he gave it up for. Inside, at last, the fold he had spent his life outside of. So the story returns to where it began, to the crowds and the smile. Once they had lined the streets of 4 continents for him, wept for him, reached out their hands to touch him, certain each one that the Golden Prince had smiled at them alone. And at the end, they came again, in their thousands, down the long hill at Windsor, to file past his coffin in silence. The adoration had run one way his whole life, poured out by millions and returned. His own private secretary had judged by almost nothing. He had been given beauty and charm and position and wealth and the love of the world, every gift except a soul, and he had taken all of it and given back a wasted throne, a burdened brother, a grieving mother, and 35 years of exile spent nursing a wound over a title his wife would never use. The most charming prince the century produced was, to the very end, and to the people who knew him best, the king nobody could stand. And the coldest verdict on him was passed not by his enemies, but by the loyal servant who had wanted more than anything to admire him, and could not. If this story held you, then subscribe, because there are many more like it still to come, told from inside the household rather than from the throne. And tell me, down in the comments, where in the world you are watching from, and what you make of the man. Do you think he ever truly understood what he had thrown away? Or did he die believing the world had wronged him? I read every reply, and you are the reason this channel exists.